You ever have one of those moments where you look back and think, I really wish I'd just ignored the letter or maybe moved to Florida instead? Yeah, that's me. Dale Carter, the guy who bought a house for a reason, most folks would call nuts a battered old retaining wall out back. Not for the looks, not for curb appeal, but because after 30 years wrangling mudslides and landslides as a geological engineer, I saw what everyone else missed. That wall meant safety. And safety beats pretty every day of the week, you know what I mean? But in my neighborhood, the HOA had other plans like they always do. 3 days after they tore that wall down, the whole hillside caved in like a scene out of an end-of-the-world movie. Then, like clockwork, they tried to pin the blame on me. Wild, right? Let me back up a sec, because if you've ever tangled with an HOA, you know things always get messier before they make any sense. See, I'm not new to this game. I've spent decades reading dirt the way some people read tea leaves. The first day I walked that property, I ran my hand along that rough concrete feeling for cracks, for history, and I could tell whoever built that wall actually cared. It wasn't pretty, but it was built for a reason, to keep tons of earth from sliding down and wiping out half the block when the rains came. Beauty wasn't the point. But the folks running the show around here, well, they cared a whole lot more about how things looked than how they worked. For the first few weeks, life was good. The neighborhood felt sleepy, safe, filled with retirees like me just hoping for a little peace and quiet. But 3 weeks in a letter shows up fancy gold lettering official as you please. I thought maybe it was a welcome note. Instead, it was a notice from Nora Prescott, our HOA president, telling me that wall of mine violated aesthetic standards and had to be torn down in 30 days. I laughed at first. I really did. But Nora wasn't joking, and she wasn't listening. I called, tried to explain, even offered a folder full of soil surveys and weather data, 30 years of expertise packed into one desperate plea for common sense. She never looked twice. Mr. Carter, I trust our experts, she said, waving off everything I'd brought. It was clear from the jump this wasn't about safety. It was about power, about proving whose opinion mattered more. So I started fighting back. Dug up old permits, the original engineering drawings, photos, records. Wrote a letter loaded with enough technical jargon to make anyone's head spin. Requested a full board hearing. And what did I get? A rejection letter plus a threat of $100 a day in fines if I didn't rip out the wall myself. They even said they'd do it for me and bill me $8,000. That's when I realized I needed backup. That's where Lena Harmon comes in, an investigative reporter with a nose for HOA nonsense and a real talent for digging where others don't. She starts sniffing around, asking all the right questions. Ever notice it's always the same contractor doing these projects, she says. I hadn't, but suddenly a lot started to click. Meanwhile, the HOA rolls in with their independent engineers, who spend all of 20 minutes poking around and declare the wall dangerous without a single soil sample or real test. Total joke, except it's my life on the line. Monday morning, the bulldozers roll up, and even the demolition guy apologizes to me, says he just follows orders. I make one last desperate call to Nora's office, get brushed off again, and then stand at my kitchen window watching as 50 years of smart engineering gets reduced to rubble. You ever watch a slow-motion disaster you can't stop? That was me, coffee in hand, sick to my stomach, counting each blow as they smashed that wall to bits. Afterwards, everything looked better, which was the cruel part. Smooth dirt, grass seed like a bad haircut covered with a fancy hat. But I could see the water patterns changing, small gullies starting the first hints of trouble. Then Lena comes back, news in hand. Turns out every big aesthetic project in our neighborhood for the last few years went to the same contractor, Nora's brother-in-law, if you can believe it. And all it took was one rainy week for the whole truth to come sliding down. The storm hit hard. 2 days of rain, then just after midnight, a roar woke me up that I'll never forget. The hillside collapsed, tons of mud and rock crashing down, burying 4 houses, clogging the street, making the neighborhood look like it had been through a war. I stood in my pajamas, staring at the mess, thinking, well, they can't blame me now. Except that's exactly what Nora tried to do. She called me up, voice cold as ice, accusing me of unauthorized modifications and blaming me for the landslide. Said I'd be hearing from her lawyer. That's when I realized this wasn't just about dirt anymore. It was about truth and who the neighbors would believe. So I started knocking on doors, showing folks my evidence, permits, photos, everything. Most saw the sense of it, especially the folks whose houses took the brunt of the slide. But there were holdouts, led by a guy named Bob Patterson, who'd moved in last year and seemed to think polished meant right. Lines got drawn, and the next HOA meeting turned into a showdown. With Lena's help, I laid everything out. Original permits, before and after photos, the storm timeline, and the emails she'd uncovered Nora and her family contractor talking about revenue targets and cover stories. The room got quiet when I asked if removing the wall made things safer. How come we just had the worst landslide in 50 years? Even the so-called experts couldn't spin their way out of that one. That night the board went down hard, 43-18. Nora looked stunned, but I knew better than to think she'd go quietly. Lena kept digging, and pretty soon the scandal broke wide open. Fraud, conspiracy, kickbacks. Turns out Nora's whole game was about funneling HOA money to family and friends with safety be damned. Even the engineer who signed off on the demolition, not licensed, fake degree, just a stooge for the contractor. The county DA jumped in, the state licensing board got involved, and the insurance companies, after a fight, finally agreed to pay. The new board, led by a steady old teacher named Marcus, brought me in as a technical advisor. Together, we worked up a real fix, new barriers, better drainage, and more transparency than this neighborhood had ever seen. That fall, the first big storm came through, and the water went right where it was supposed to, safe, steady, like it should have been all along. Nora ended up in court facing fraud and conspiracy charges. The jury didn't buy her act for a second. 6 years in state prison, personal bankruptcy, and new state laws passed because of our mess. Some neighbors shook my hand, some crossed the street when they saw me. That's life, I guess. Truth wins, but it doesn't always win you friends. Still, every time I watch the rain run harmlessly off that hill, I know we did something that matters. We beat corruption, fixed what was broken, and proved that ordinary people can stand up to power when it counts. And yeah, it cost me sleep money and a piece of my retirement, but it was worth it. So what about you? Ever fight the system and actually win? Or did you get steamrolled? Drop a comment, share your story. Because if there's one thing I learned, it's that none of us fights these battles alone. And in this neighborhood, at least, we've got receipts.